So, what I'm going to go over with you today is how to learn the lingo of being a coach, trainer, clinician, etc. And I want to preface this by saying I'm not going over everything that there is about learning the language, right? What I am going to go over is some basic stuff that I think that it's important to understand, like different movements of the shoulders, hips, things like that, right? So, let's get into why that's important. Well, let's first think of the fact that in order to be able to effectively communicate, we need to be able to understand the terminology that leads to improved learning, right? So it's not necessarily the fact that we want to be talking circles around our clients, right? But it more so is the fact that if you want to progress in how you learn and understand the way the body works and understand the way to better serve your clients, then you first have to understand, what are you even saying? If you take a continuing education class and you don't even understand the words that they're saying, how could you then expect to be able to effectively learn, become an educated and sound professional? Or even if you have one of those clients that does ask a lot of questions or really knows what they're talking about and wants to test you, which will happen if you do this long enough and at a high enough level, then what are you going to do when you don't know how to answer that? So language matters. Now, it's not, I guess in a sense it is semantics. We're talking about semantics here, but semantics are not something to write off when we're talking about just being like an aspect of language, right? I'm a huge fan of understanding the language here because it's a professional sense. You never go to someone if you go to a high level business meeting, right? And you don't understand what a KPI is. Well, you're going to look like you don't know what they're not going to, if you don't even know what a KPI is, right? A key point of interest, then how are they going to take you serious at a business meeting, right? So language does matter, and it's not just semantics that we write off, okay? So as we go into this, the first one that I want to hit on is mobility. And now this is not the actual technical term for mobility, right? Because mobility can be looked at as passive and active range of motion of a joint. Mobility is the range of motion of a joint, but from the way that you're probably going to explain it to your clients, mobility is going to be your active range of motion, whereas flexibility will be your passive range of motion. So our active range of motion is the range of motion of a joint that can be achieved by actively using the muscle to do so. So this would be me demonstrating my mobility, right? My shoulder, my overhead range of motion. Whereas this would be, say I'm stretching overhead, or I have something that's pulling me overhead, would be less of my active mobility and it would be more of my passive mobility, more of my flexibility in that sense, right? So what I would like to say is for the concept of being an effective trainer or coach, right? I think that mobility should be looked at as your active range of motion. Now, if you're a clinician and you need to work with specific joint mobility and you need to measure degrees of passive versus active ranges of motion, maybe you want to use the term mobility as all encompassing. That's technically true, right? But as far as talking to your clients goes, if we want to improve mobility, we want to improve our way to do so actively, right? And when we go to retest, that's just for us. That we're talking about the passive range of motion. For them, what they really want to worry about is their active ranges of motion. Now, the big concept that you're going to see, because as we get into stability, which is the next aspect that we're going to look at, is you have to understand some things here. So the one that we're going to look at right now is center of mass, or center of gravity is technically the right term, but center of mass is generally the most talked about version of that, right? So your center of mass is the point around which so say you're the object, it's the point around you at which your mass is equally distributed in all directions, right? The center of mass is fluid and it can change, and it can as we move through space or we change our body's base of support, which if we look at what base of support is, the area beneath an object or a person that includes every point of contact that the object or person has with the supporting surface, right? So as I'm sitting right now, my base of support is not just my feet on the ground. It's my butt on the chair. It's my back on the chair. It's my hands on the rest here, right? That's going to alter the amount of internal versus external stability that I require, which is something that we're about to go over in a second, right? So as we go back to center of mass, something that I want to hit on is, at rest, our center of mass tends to lie around the level of like the belly button, more specifically, slightly forward of the second lumbar vertebrae, being L2. Okay, so it's really important to know that that's where our center of mass is. That's where we're even in all directions, right? But remember, this is so crucial that it's going to be fluid and it's going to change as we move through space or as we change our base of support. So let's get deeper into base of support now. So base of support, like I said, is the area beneath an object or a person that includes every point of contact that the object or person makes with the supporting surface. So how can we start to limit or increase base of support, right? So we can look at like this like spectrum of constraints, I like to think of it, right? If we have someone that we want to increase their base of support and afford them the most external stability, so the more stability that they don't have to work for, we're probably going to lay them on something like the ground, right? The ground or a table. If someone is lying on their back, that's about as much stability as you're ever going to afford someone in a training setting, right? So that is an increased base of support. They're lying on the ground, their back, their hands, the back of their head, their legs, everything is in contact with the ground, right? As you sit up into like an L position, right? Where you sit up from the ground, your legs are out straight, and you're now legs here, upper body here, right? You have decreased your base of support, right? So there's now an increased stability demand here. And there's been a change to your center of mass. So when you're lying on your back, if you even practice it, you could sit on the ground right now. If you lie on your back, that's going to be really easy to do. As you sit in a perfect L position, you're going to have to find some core. You're probably going to feel like your hamstrings are tight in order to be able to hold that position there. If we then take that and we go up to like a kneeling position, we've now decreased our base of support more. Now it's just our knees, our lower legs, and our feet on the ground, our butts off the ground there. There's more demand for internal stability at this point, and there's less external stability. We could take that to a half kneeling position. So now we only have one foot and then one knee and lower leg on the ground. That's less base of support now. And now it's more spread out. We have a deviated center of mass as well, right? Now, if we were to then stand up and we were just on our feet, that's going to be the common bilateral stance, which still it is a position of stability. I don't want you to think that being on 2 feet is unstable in nature, but it is less stable in nature than being in the half kneeling, the seated, or the floor, the L-sit position, right? So that's something that's really crucial to understand as you move forward in training, is that the more that someone has support constraints up against them, the more stability that they have without them having to generate more internal stability. That's their external stability, okay? Now, unilateral training would be our one arm or one leg. And that's always going to be less stable because we create more of a demand on stability when we take away some part of our base of support. So if we have both feet on the ground, we have more to balance between, right? Our center of mass is balanced between our 2 feet, right? As we take off one, now we have to shift our body over this single leg, and we have to be able to create stability to hold ourselves in position over that individually fixed leg. So unilateral training, that's why it's going to have a greater demand for stability, is because we've changed our base of support and we've had to organize our center of mass over a smaller, more precise base of support now. Now, like I said, bilateral training is going to be the more stable option. Most of your training in the gym should be bilateral in nature. Sagittal plane, which we're going to get into, bilateral training. Get good at that and then let the unilateral training fill in the other gaps. So stability is going to be our muscle's ability to resist force. It's the ability of the object to maintain its center of mass over our base of support. So like I said, if we have to go onto one leg and we have to shift ourselves over, right? It's our ability of our glutes, our core, our everything to be able to hold us in a position where we can maintain our position. So stability is the ability to resist force, and the ability to hold positions is going to be really what that aspect is, right? Stability is not necessarily like shaking on a Bosu ball. Stability is if I have one leg off the ground and I have a dumbbell in one hand that's deviating my center of mass and wants to push me in this direction, can my muscles co-contract to stabilize me over that mix between a deviated center of mass and that limited base of support, right? So stability is a really crucial one. It's our ability to hold positions. I like to think of mobility as our ability to actively get into positions, whereas stability is our ability to maintain positions, right? Remember, mobility can be looked at as passive ranges of motion of a joint. I understand that, but for a training context, we're going to talk about mobility as being able to get into position, stability being able to maintain that position and resist forces that want to pull you in or out of it or side to side, right? And then once you're, so, or before we even get to that, when we talk about the types of stability, like I said before, there's external stability, there's internal stability. We can think about functional stability, and we can think about structural stability. And I'm going to go through all those right now. So external stability is what is afforded to us, like I said, by our external environment. So it could be machines, benches, cables, the wall, or the ground, right? Anything that gives you something to lean on, in a sense, right? Whereas internal stability is going to have two components: stability that is afforded to us by our function, and that is afforded to us by our structure. And this is a really big thing to understand. So functional stability is variable, and it's represented by the active tissues in the body. So think like muscles, tendons, fascia is a big one there. And it can be improved when we apply the right type of stimulus to those active tissues that then forces them to adapt in order to better contribute to stability, to being able to hold and maintain various positions at joints through various points of the body, right? Now, on the other half, so functional stability is the ability of our muscles to functionally stabilize and hold positions and stabilize joints, right? Muscles manage torque at joints. They manage rotational forces at joints. They manage our ability to hold positions at joints, right? Whereas structural stability is more fixed in nature, and it's from our more inert tissues. So the tissues that we don't call upon through the nervous system to actively contract, right? So these tissues don't produce movement, but they're essential to our movement, right? These are our bones, our ligaments. This structural stability can be affected, and there's different types of, I guess, whether male versus female, or injuries or disease. There can be different levels of structural stability that someone has. I've had clients that have one or two fingers, or they're missing toes, or they have an arm that's bent, right? And they don't have the same level of structural stability, or you'll get some that might be missing a leg or this or that, especially if you work with veteran populations and wounded warriors and stuff like that. So it's important to understand that we do have stability afforded to us, not just by the external sources of the ground, right? And the chairs and the this and the that, but we do have our muscles that actively, they that's what they do. They're always managing our center of mass. They inherently are stabilizers. All muscles act in a sense to stabilize joints. And then there's that structural stability that we have when our bones stack on top of each other, our ligaments that hold everything together and things like that. Okay. So very important that we went through that. As we then get into strength, and strength is going to be our ability to produce force as we move our muscle from insertion to origin against resistance, right? And a lot of these, when I think of where I've drawn a lot of my learning from, if you can think of people, I think of people like Pat Davidson, Jordan Shallow. There's the PRI teachings. There's a lot of great sources out there. Anyone from, there's so many people that I've learned from. I don't even know how to put it all into one right here. But some of these definitions are specifically from Jordan Shallow's. I like his company Prescript, Jordan Shallow and Jordan Ginta, and they do a really great job at making it simple. And I'm kind of passing on some of those teachings here to you. So I highly recommend, if you're not just going to me for a source, go to some of these other people and expose yourself to their products, because I'm telling you, the things that they do are great for the industry too. So strength is our muscle's ability to produce force as we move our muscle from insertion to origin against resistance, right? So strength is our ability to do the thing. We have to be mobile enough to get into positions that then we are stable enough to hold positions for us to be competent enough, I should say, to then produce force, to produce strength and overcome resistance by moving our muscle from insertion to origin against resistance, right? Now there's a different, as we go through force production, there's other things like power, and we talk about power and speed, and we're getting more into the rate at which we produce force, right? But if we start just bare bones, how do we make people move better? How do we make people more stable? And how do we just get people stronger? The rest is going to follow suit as you implement that with training. So the main things that we want to focus on is, how can we improve mobility at joints and across the body in an integrated sense? How can we be able to stabilize those joints in those positions? And then how do we make people stronger once we have all of that, or as we work on that in the background? So I mentioned this one before, planes of motion. And I'm going to simplify this for you at the end. So when we talk about the different planes of motion, we can think of sagittal plane is what cuts our body into left and right halves. So as you see here, we have this divider that goes down this person. We cut our body into left and right halves. Now, the perfect example of sagittal plane motion is going to be running, right? It could be running, it could be squatting, anything where you're like pretty much staying in place. You're going either up and down or forward and back, and maybe not staying in place, right? I guess. And then the frontal plane is going to cut our body front and back halves, right? And it's our side to side movements. You could think of lateral raises, right? Moving out to the sides, that's frontal plane. We could think of moving our whole body side to side, like a lateral shuffle or a side bend or something like that, right? And then we have the transverse plane, which is like the all-encompassing. It's our rotational plane of motion, and it's what cuts the body into top and bottom halves, right? So it's our rotational stuff here. It's what we move through. It's our cable wood chops, our med ball side tosses, even a pec deck fly. If you think about a pec deck fly, how it comes around, force is pulling you around the back, force is bringing you around the front, right? So it's not just sagittal plane, because this would be sagittal plane, but this rotational axis is not sagittal plane, right? Or anything like swinging is a huge one. Swinging, punching, anything like that, right? So here's how I'm going to simplify it for you. When you go to look at sagittal, frontal, and transverse planes, here's how I think that it's the most easy to think of. When we go to look at, is something happening in the sagittal plane? So say someone's running, right? We can tell they're coming in the sagittal plane most easily by looking at it from the side. S, sagittal plane, we observe from the side. So we see people are going to squat, and we want to see how they move through the sagittal plane in the squat. We look at them from the side. Yeah, you can look at the squat through behind from the rear view, right? But at that point, if you're looking at shift side to side, you're looking at the frontal plane. So then that leads into the next one. But think of this: sagittal plane, we observe from the side when we want to see sagittal plane. Frontal plane, we look at from the front or the back. So sagittal, side, S, frontal, F, front or back, right? And then transverse plane, if you want to view the transverse plane, look at the letter T. Transverse T, we can look at from the top. If you look top down, bird's eye view, you can see everything that's happening through that transverse plane. As the body rotates, think of the spine as that center point, the main axis upon which everything rotates around, right? You're looking straight down through the top of the spine down, and you can see the feet move, the arms move, everything rotate around the spine, right? You can think of that from the top, or I even like to kind of take myself away and I look at things from the bottom, and I see the way that we organize ourselves around our feet, right? And that's just totally different. That's how my mind works. But so yeah, if you're ever confused, just think of, and you get mixed up with sagittal, frontal, or transverse, just think of, where do we observe these from? If I want to see sagittal, S, I look from the side. If I want to see frontal, F, I look from the front or the back. If I want to see transverse, T, I look from the top or the bottom, like I said, right? That's going to be how we look at those. Now, as we move into some specific actions at joints and limbs of the body, we're going to think about flexion and extension first. So flexion is a bending at a joint where the relative angle between two adjoining segments decreases, right? So they get closer together. Extension is bending at a joint where a relative angle between two adjoining segments increases. So if we think of the biceps, right? Flexion, we're bringing these points together, right? We're decreasing the angle here. Whereas if we then did a tricep extension, we're getting this and this away from each other, right? So we have those two segments being the upper or the lower arm and the upper arm right there. We have those coming further away from each other, and that angle between those is increasing, right? It's getting bigger. And then what I want you to understand is, and I guess I can stand up and I can show you, is, like this here, people get kind of mixed up on sometimes. So if you look here, flexion, yes, as we bring that knee up closer to the chest, that is open chain flexion. As we bring that leg behind you, that is open chain extension. But if we think of a hinge, like a hip hinge, for example, or squat or anything like that, right? I know I'm not necessarily lifting my leg up off the ground like you see in that video as I go into flexion here, right? But if I go into a hinge, even though I didn't raise this up, that is still flexion of that hip as I bring these 2 points closer together. So understand, when we hear flexion and extension, that it's not always like the open chain action, right? It can be bring the whole halves of the body together. And we have spinal flexion versus extension, right? It's not just joints here and here. It's the massive snake that's composed of all the joints being our spine, the hub of stability and movement in the body. Excuse me, I had a little burp coming through there. And that we have the flexion and extension there too. I don't want you to think that this is something that's just elbows and knees and things like that. When we get down into the feet and things like that, we'll talk more about that. I'm not going to get deep into the feet today, though, because that can really confuse people. And that'll be one that as we do these lectures later on in the future, we can talk specific about how the feet move very, very interestingly. Kind of like feet and hands move really in an interesting manner. As we look at abduction versus adduction, we can think of abduction as moving a limb away from the midline, and we can think of shoulder adduction, if you look at the screen, as bringing one towards the midline. Here's how I'm going to make it super simple for you. You'll never forget it this way, okay? Think of abduction, right? ABD, abduction, right? ABD, abandon ship. Abduction, we're jumping off the ship. We're going out to the side, right? Abduction, abandon, off to the ship. Abandon ship, abduction. Adduction, we're jumping back on the ship. We're coming towards the midline. So if you ever can't remember and you think about abduction, think of arm away from the butt. Okay, abduction, out here, I'm jumping away from the ship. Adduction, I'm coming in. If you're doing like the hit machine, if you think of, right? Abduction, abandon ship, jump out the sides. Adduction, hop back on the ship, okay? You'll never forget that one. I'm not going to waste much time on it. As we look at internal and external rotation, people tend to get confused with this one. So internal, or I guess we'll start with external rotation. External rotation is rotation in the direction away from the midline of the body. So if I were to hold my arm up here at 90 degrees, and I want you to understand, we're going to go through external rotation and internal rotation. That's still the same here. It's just internal rotation, external rotation this way now. The difference is we are more adducted, jump to the ship, abducted away from the ship, okay? So when you see people at these angles, don't get confused in terms of external versus internal this way. It's still external if you're this way, right? Even if it's here, okay? So internal rotation is then rotation in towards the midline of the body, right? Internal rotation is paired with, it's a compression strategy. It's our force production. Everyone likes to demonize internal rotation sometimes, but internal rotation is how we produce our force. We need to be able to internally rotate. If you're punching, right, you don't punch like externally rotating unless you lose fights, right? You internally rotate, you produce force, boom, you explode across the body, right? So we need to understand that internal and external rotation are both extremely crucial. We have to have a balance of both. We have to be able to produce force and we have to be able to absorb force. That's always going to be something that you hear in the future, right? And we have to be able to have that space around joints for the joints to be able to move properly and the muscles to have the proper leverage that they need to have, okay? So that's really all I'm going to go over with here is, you know, you can see in the pictures, if you were to lie someone on their back and you swing their foot in towards them, that's their hip rotating out. Okay. So in is out and then out, the foot going out is in at the hip. Okay. And you can practice with that and understand that some more, but I just want you to understand what internal and external rotation are. Now, motions at the shoulder, this is when it gets kind of complicated here, and for good reason. The shoulder is super complex, okay? So if you ever get stuck on the shoulder, don't sweat it, because that's going to happen. So when we look at motions at the shoulder, elevation is what we're going to start with. So elevation is bringing that whole shoulder up. Elevation, it's an elevator, okay? Depression, the shoulders get sad and they want to come down, right? So depression is shoulders sink down, elevation is shoulders come up. Now, I'm showing you right there to be exaggerating, but it's not anything to do with flexion and extension right now. It's just elevation, depression. When you want to work more on elevation, you think of bringing shoulders to the ears. When you want someone to maintain better depression, you keep shoulders away from the ears. And that's a really good cue to use on a lot of people. Retraction is going to be bringing the shoulder blades towards the spine. So if I were, the way that I've always told people is picture like you took this pencil, right? And down the center of my spine on the back, I rested that pencil there. And if you don't drop the pencil, you get $1 million, right? So what do you have to do? For you to hold it on your own, you got to squeeze your shoulders together and try and pinch through shoulder blades against that pencil to hold it there so you can keep $1 million. And the second that you let them move away, they go into protraction. Protraction gives your money away. Now, it's not saying retraction is more important than protraction at all. I'm just saying for the context of that scenario, if you want to retract, you got to be able to pull those shoulder blades towards the spine. And there's going to be an element, you have to understand that these things don't happen separately. It's not like I'm elevating, when I do certain exercises, depressing when I do certain exercises, then upward rotation on some and downward rotation on some. It's like you're going to have retraction and downward rotation and depression all happening at the same time and things like that, or even elevation, right? So you need to understand that these things all happen at the same time. Scapula anteriorly, posteriorly tilts, it moves, it rotates, it moves up and down, and it glides. It's a really dynamic thing, and it just doesn't happen as all these separate actions. But anyways, so we went over the top half. Now, protraction. Protraction is going to be the scapula moving away from our spine, okay? And the really big one, that the muscle that gets a lot of focus, which is rightfully so. Sometimes I think that if we have scapular issues and we just shoot right to serratus, we're missing the point, because the real thing that we want to work on if we're trying to restore scapular mobility and stability is we have to look at how the rib cage, the shape of the rib cage, how the scapula can have the right relationship with the rib cage, how the spine can move if we have a rotational or a lateral deficit in movement of the spine, flexion extension deficit in movement of the spine, right? A sagittal plane, frontal plane, or transverse plane movement of the spine, right? We need to be able to look at the spine and then the rib cage, and then are those even in the right place for the scapula to be able to do its thing? And then maybe it is the serratus muscle, which does glide and kind of into upward rotation and protraction, right, as it pulls on the scapula, and it also hugs that scapula to the rib cage. So it is important in that aspect, but I don't want you to always think that, if we have an issue, it's got to be serratus. And the tip that I'll give you as we get into this today is anything. So the scapula really comes into play as we get overhead, and we're going to get more into that in the future, right? If the scapula, once we get over 90 degrees, right, we know that the scapula comes more into play. So if we have a shoulder pain or shoulder movement issue and it only happens in the overhead, we can kind of like narrow our focus. Maybe it's an issue with the scapula, right? If we have an issue down here, the scapula doesn't come into play up until 90 degrees. So we can assume, now it's not always going to be this case because it can still be rotator cuff up here, just like it can still be scapula down here, but we can assume that it's more likely a rotator cuff issue if it's below 90 degrees. Now, when we look at upward and downward rotation, this is really like when it all comes together. So upward rotation, those scapulas come up and around the rib cage. They really glide up over. Downward rotation, they rotate downward. You're going to get a ton of, for upward rotation, a good example might be if you're doing a chin up or a landmine press. Anything reaching is going to be a lot of upward rotation. As you row back down, that's going to be more of like the downward rotation aspect you can think of, okay? And there is an aspect of, we talked about kind of like anteriorly and posteriorly tilting the scapula, but I don't want to get too much into that today. I just want to learn the basics of like what is going on at the shoulder so you understand those things. Now, something that I do want to get into real fast is the pelvic tilt aspect, right? And I don't ever want you demonizing one. Like this is the Kim K one, the anterior pelvic tilt. This is the one that people often want to demonize when someone's stuck in, right? This can be just as bad, right? This can even be a presentation where people have pain. So don't think that this automatically means pain, right? We just need to be able to achieve this and achieve this if we try to, and we want to try and live more near this, right? So the issue isn't, oh, are you in an anterior pelvic tilt? The issue is when you're in an anterior pelvic tilt and you can't posteriorly tilt or you can't get back to neutral. If they present like this, but they can get back to this, or they can get back to this on command, I'm not really worried. If there's no pain and performance is good, maybe we can get some more range of motion at the joints and put things in a little bit better position to work if we live a little bit more neutral, right? But I'm not going to sit here saying that we need to take away from our training to magnify how important the anterior pelvic tilt is and focus mostly on that. And in the future, we're going to get into looking at these anterior versus posterior pelvic tilts and look at how these can influence movement. That is something to understand, is what ranges of motion might this person lack? Maybe the anterior pelvic tilt person's going to lack rotation, internal rotation of the hips, because they're already into internal rotation. Their femurs are already internally rotated. Remember, turning in towards the midline. And I guess the only thing I will tell you is, when we think of this anterior pelvic tilt, that arch back, that kind of butt up position happens because the pelvis tilts forward, right? Posteriorly tilt, we want that pelvis to kind of tip back. We're thinking about the top of the pelvis tilts back, top of the pelvis tilts down, and anterior. Neutral, it kind of lives here and it's able to fluctuate between the two, right? I don't want to get crazy into that. That's going to be something that we look at in the future. What I will say is, think of what this person's trying to do, right? They're trying to manage their center mass. If there's someone that is stuck here, whoops, didn't mean to hit that. If there's someone that's stuck here, they're probably stuck here because they're trying to manage our center mass. And too often we think of like, how do we stretch out the muscles on the front side or the back side or this or that? We don't look at how do we shift their center of mass back so that we can bring the rib cage back over the pelvis so that they don't have to kick the butt back and have the front of the body shifted forward to be able to find that center line. This is a properly managed center of mass. This is center of mass, rib cage over pelvis, stacked over base of support. This is one where center of mass is falling back all the time, and they're having to push their hips forward to be able to maintain this center spot. Whereas this one, their center mass is always forward, and they're trying to push their hips back to maintain that center line, okay? So this all generally comes down to center of mass management. That's going to be a huge thing that we talk about in the future. Now, lastly, a couple things that I want to hit on is, and I only have one more slide after this. There's a lot more to talk about, but I think that just understanding that these things is probably where you need to go. And the terminology that I want to really focus on are the corners here, what you're going to look at. So anterior here and posterior here and ipsilateral and contralateral are all really important. I have them highlighted here because those are also terminology that we use for loading positions. They're references to the side or the position of the body, but they're also references to where we load. So let's start with those four. Anterior relates to the front of the body. So what would an anterior load be? If we think of front of the body, it would be a goblet squat. It would be a Zercher squat, a front squat, anything like that, right? And what is that going to do? Well, think if we have this weight that wants to pull us forward, we then have to resist that and shift our center of mass back over our base of support. So that can be an option to help someone shift their center mass back over the base of support, not because this is going to shift their center mass back. It's going to push, it's going to kind of want to make them pull forward. And if they pull forward, they drop the weight. So in order to do that, they have to shift their center of mass back and learn how to better manage that, okay? Whereas the posterior load is going to shift someone's center mass forward, okay? And that's something that's good to know. And that's usually, though, also going to be our most loadable. It's going to be our position where we have the most force production capabilities, that posterior load there. And that can vary. Don't get me wrong, because that's not everything is a squat, right? But that's generally, we have a bar on our back. We are the most structurally supported. We are in the most force producing position. I don't know why I said it like that. And we are ready to do the big, heavy stuff, right? Contralateral means the opposite side of the body. So if I'm in a split stance position and my left leg is forward and my right hand has a dumbbell, that is the contralateral load. And remember, the body is always shifting away from where you place the weight to then manage that change in center mass, that deviation of center mass away from the base of support. So if I put this dumbbell in the right hand, my left leg's forward in a split squat, say I'm doing a Bulgarian split squat, that load there is going to shift me more into that left hip that is forward there. And I'm going to get more stretch on the glutes, more internal rotation of the femur. That's all really important stuff to know. Whereas an ipsilateral load is on the same side of the body. So if I had that same left leg forward, but I switched the dumbbells now and I had left hand and left leg, that is an ipsilaterally loaded split squat. And now, because I'm shifting away from the load, I'm going to bias more external rotation of that hip joint. Now that can change as we add more load, and there's some nuance to that, but we're not really going to get into that today. So remember, anterior load is your front rack and your goblet and your Zercher positions. Posterior load is your safety bar and your back squat and things like that. Contralateral load is opposite of the working arm or leg. Ipsilateral is the same side of the body. And then when we think of the other words that you hear on here, we have superior versus inferior. So superior means closest to the top of the body. When I think of superior, I think of like the superior court. That's the top court, right? And then when we think of inferior, we think of closest to the bottom of the body. So it's the little guy, the inferior little guy we can think of, right? So if we're thinking of, my pecs are superior to my rectus abdominis. My pecs are above my abs, you can think of, and my abs are inferior to my pecs, okay? Proximal versus distal. So proximal is closest to the center line of the body. So the proximal attachment of the biceps would be up here towards the shoulder more. The distal attachment of the biceps would be more towards the elbow here. And that is important to understand because we do want to know, like, is it a proximal issue versus a distal issue? Are we doing more of like eccentric, long length training? Are we biasing more of like that distal aspect, that attachment point of a muscle? Are we maybe biasing more of the proximal if we're doing more of a shortened one? I do think that there is some nuance to that, and I'm not going to get into that, but that is a belief of mine that I hold. And then Medial versus lateral. So medial is closest to the inside. So medial is like when we think of adduction coming in, that's medial, right? We can think of medial as the inside of the leg here, your adductors. We can think of lateral as the outside. So we're thinking like a shuffle, right? If we're shuffling laterally, we're going outside. So think lateral is the outside part of the body, medial is the inside part of the body. And that's just some terminology. There's a ton of terminology down from intraset variables and volume, load, and this and that, and blah, blah, blah. I just wanted you to know the basics of how the body represents now. And the only one that I'll give you to segue into training terminology is we talk about the difference in contraction types, because these are described by how muscles produce force in different ways at different lengths or changes of lengths. Okay, so eccentric contractions are your negatives. They're your lowering. So it could be the going down in a squat, or letting my arm out in a pull, or a bicep curl, or a lat pull down, letting the arm out. That's when a muscle produces force while lengthening to resist the external force. Okay. The concentric, so the eccentric is that negative, it's the lowering, right? That doesn't mean that it's not as important. The eccentric is actually when we are strongest. We have the most, not just force production capability, but we have support and elasticity of passive tissues that would be able to support and kind of give us that lengthening pullback. Like as if you pulled a rubber band back, think of where's a rubber band the strongest is when you pull it apart. That's that eccentric tension that you've built in that rubber band, right? Now, the concentric is when that rubber band snaps together. It's when it shortens to overcome an external force, right? So when I say go to do a bench press, my pecs, shoulders, triceps are all closing the distance between each other. They're squeezing hard to drive this up and overcome the weight of the bench press, overcome the weight, the influence that gravity has on the amount of load on top of your body, right? So concentric is when you shorten a muscle to overcome an external force, right? Whereas eccentric is when you're lengthening a muscle while producing a force to resist that change in length, okay? Now, isometric is when you're really trying to not let any change in length happen at all. Actually, you're trying to produce force to maintain the exact length. So eccentric, you're resisting an external force. You're slowing down the rate at which the muscle lengthens because you're producing force as the muscle lengthens to slow down, in a sense, kind of like it's like a failed isometric, right? That's why they're kind of both to resist the change in length, except the eccentric, you're actually letting it out. You're just trying to slow the rate down by producing as much force as possible, right? Isometric is when the muscle produces force as it maintains the same length. So this could happen in all different states of the contraction. It could happen at a more lengthened position. It could happen at a more shortened squeeze position. But the isometric position is when you're trying to hold still. And then there's two main types of isometric contractions that we're probably going to hit on. And those are your overcoming and your yielding isometrics. Overcoming isometrics is like if I took this wall right now, and I know I'm never going to be able to push over that wall, but I push as hard as I can. I'm pressing maximally, producing maximum force to try and overcome that force that will never actually move, right? Whereas yielding is if I were to hold this, even this Gatorade bottle here, and I know it's light right now, but over time, with time, right now I'm isometrically contracting to hold this out. Over time, as I get fatigued, it's going to be super hard and hard and hard to hold that up. And eventually I'm going to yield to it and it's going to win, right? So you're yielding isometric is you're trying to hold a position, you're trying to resist. It's like you're trying to resist the eccentric portion of a rep happening, whereas your overcoming isometric is you're trying to produce maximal force to push through or overcome an object that you can't move. Okay, that's how we're going to look at those there. So all in all, that's going to be the main beginning points of understanding the lingo, the language of a coach. And I think that if you can learn this and I'll understand all of this stuff, it's going to help immensely as you move forward into the future with all these other lectures and lessons. So thank you guys for listening, and that'll be it for today.